Welcome to I Should Say That Out Loud, where I push myself out of my comfort zone to share my inner thoughts out loud with you to grow a greater awareness of autism in the world and also to help other autistic adults find their voice and their passion and hope for a brighter tomorrow. I'm your host, Donna Brendel, and today I am joined by international best-selling author J.D. Barker. Jonathan Dillon Parker is an international best-selling American author whose work has been broadly described as suspense thrillers, often incorporating elements of horror, crime, mystery, science fiction, and the supernatural. Perfect timing for Halloween coming up. JD's work, I believe, now ranks among great legends like Stephen King and Dean Koontz, and he also has collaborated with James Patterson, as well as many other authors. Beyond the success of his novels, his journey is uniquely personal, shaped, I suspect, by his Midwestern roots, but also by his life as an autistic man, navigating creativity, business, and self-discovery. We're going to talk today about his early life, his writing process, how autism has influenced his craft, and what advice he has for others who are chasing their passions with or without autism. And I'm so excited to welcome JD Barker to the show. Welcome, JD.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You're
But
welcome.
a title like that for your podcast, it seems like you get in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, some could. And it's so funny because a lot of people comment on that and say, I have too weak of a filter, but I'm the opposite. I have too strong of a filter and I keep my thoughts inside too much. So it's a little twist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have so much more going on inside my mind than I ever say out loud. It's different for me in writing. I say a lot more in writing than I do verbally.
Well, it's probably a lot better for your blood pressure just to get it all out.
That's true. I do have a very low blood pressure generally. So we're going to get started and just talk about background. I think you and I have a similar background growing up in the Midwest. Where did you grow up and what did you love about it?
So I was born in Lombard, Illinois. I grew up in Crystal Lake, Illinois, which is about 50 miles north or so of the city. And I loved it. I lived there until I was 14. Unfortunately, my dad was a contractor, and at one point he just couldn't take the winters anymore. So he just packed up the family, and we all moved to Florida when I was 14. So like that, completely uprooted everybody. And we tried to make that transition, but that's a big transition. Like I had a
Yeah,
snowmobile and like we took the tracks off and we put wheels on it. Like we tried to make all of it work, but like living in Florida is very different from Illinois.
that's funny. I had never imagined a snowmobile trying to maneuver in Florida.
Oh yeah, they'll float too if you
Oh
drive
my
them
gosh,
fast
that's
enough.
hilarious. Great. Yeah, I grew up in Burbank, Illinois, and Hoffman Estates in high school, and then moved to Wisconsin after high school. So I went north and you went south.
I honestly prefer north. I mean, I live in New Hampshire now. I live in a little island off the coast of Portsmouth, and I love it. We've got all four seasons again. It's something I've missed. Like when I was a kid, when you're used to having that, and all of a sudden it's
Yeah,
gone. Florida is hot and hotter. Like there's no seasons. It's 90 degrees when you walk to the mailbox at 7 o'clock in the morning, and
right.
you don't want to be outside. And like I grew up being outside, so it was very weird.
Yeah. I lived in Arizona for 4 years, so I can relate to that as well. You just don't
Yeah.
go outside in the summer.
No, and if the people that grew up in that environment, they're used to it. They do
Yeah.
everything inside. They've got the air conditioner cranking, and that's their norm. But I think when you've had a taste of actually, especially being a kid, hanging out outside, and this was the '70s, so our parents kicked us out the door and told us not to come back till the lights came on.
Right, for
Like
sure.
it was a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when the street lights came on, it was time to go home.
Time for dinner. Yeah.
Yep. So has your Midwestern background or the pre-cell phone era influenced your writing?
I think I almost everything that I've written, I'm thinking it through mentally. Like I don't think I've actually written anything that takes place in Florida. Like it all takes place in the Midwest. Like I've got a couple books in Chicago, a couple books in Pittsburgh where we lived. I just wrote one recently here in New Hampshire. So I prefer that. And a lot of them I do kind of travel back in time. Like I love writing about the 70s and the 80s, before the cell phones. And, a lot of it is because I write, horror every once in a while. I write thrillers. And cell phones have taken away a lot of the fun in that. If everybody's got a phone in their pocket, it's kind of hard to isolate them. And to have a good scary story, you need to isolate your characters. So
Yeah,
it's kind of fun to jump back to the 80s every once in a while and pretend that none of that stuff exists yet.
for sure. Yeah, I imagine nowadays, like if something scary is happening and everyone's looking at their phones, they won't even notice the scary thing happening.
Well, that's something that I've noticed quite a bit. Like even if you go back and you watch footage of like 9/11, like there are people standing in the streets that are either filming these buildings coming down or watching the buildings come down on their phones, even though they're right there. But they're acting as if they're spectators and, not realizing the fact that buildings are literally falling over 200 feet away from them and they need to leave. Like it's phones have desensitized us in a lot of ways.
That's true. Yeah. Okay, so moving into the discussion about your autism, I just want to say thank you for your courage to talk about autism and being autistic, and help you as well are helping to bring a greater awareness of autism to the world. So
Yeah,
thank
I
you
try
for
to
that.
talk about it as much as I can. I mean, I was diagnosed at 22, so I went through the first half of my life without any kind of diagnosis. Didn't know what was, I don't want to say wrong with me. I was different. I was kind of the kid that, got shuffled off into the corner in the classrooms. Parents and teachers and students, everybody alike, like they didn't really look for a way to solve that. They just kind of, dealt with it. 70s were very different. I ultimately, like, I went through high school, I finished up college, I got into the corporate world, and I was working in finance. And being autistic, I was fantastic with numbers. I was very good with computer programming. I ended up getting a job as a compliance officer, and I was writing software for a brokerage firm to basically monitor trading activity against all these rules and regulations coming out of the government at the time. And when I was locked in my office just working on that sort of thing, everything was fantastic. But every once in a while, I would find a transaction that took place, and I'd have to talk to the broker that processed that transaction or their supervisor, because something about it was wrong. Either they broke a law or they skirted it, or something. But we had to have that dialogue. So it was kind of a confrontational, thing to begin with. But being autistic, like I didn't know how to navigate those waters, so I would end up in these, a lot of times in arguments and fights because of this kind of thing.
Hmm.
My boss was smart enough to recognize the fact that I was good at the job, but he thought that I had trouble with, the people portion of it, people skills. He thought that I needed to go to an anger management class. So he sent me off to one of those. And I was sitting with the therapist, kind of like an introductory thing. And we were about 20 minutes into our first conversation. And she stopped and she said, "Hey, have you ever been tested for autism?" And I had no idea what that really was, other than, like seeing Rain Man when I was a kid. Like it's not something I had ever studied before. But she said, "Well, the entire time we've been talking, you haven't made eye contact. I've noticed that you rub your thumb and your forefinger together whenever you're thinking about something." And she just started pointing out all these different things that I've done my entire life that I've never really thought about. And then she asked if I wanted to get tested. And, we ended up doing that. And ultimately, we landed on a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. Today's world, you're just on the spectrum somewhere, but they used to have a name to it. And for me, being an autistic person, all of a sudden I had a problem that I could solve, which is no different than putting a puzzle in front of me. I need to get that puzzle finished. So I researched everything I possibly could. I read a ton of books, watched a bunch of documentaries, any piece of information I could get on it. And we made a list of things that we saw as benefits related to this condition, and also another list of things that we needed to fix. And we worked hard on both of those. I doubled down on the ones that worked, and we worked towards correcting all the other ones. And I've been doing that. It's 30 some years at this point. It never ends. But it's having that diagnosis for me was key, because it just gave me an answer.
That's fantastic. What an astute counselor you had to notice those things, and that the person was aware
Yeah,
of the
and
autistic
the funny thing
traits.
is she didn't normally work with adults. She normally worked with autistic children during the
Wow,
daytime. Yeah, the anger management thing, I guess, was just a side hustle she was starting. So a lot of
interesting.
pieces aligned that didn't necessarily have to.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I started researching it for myself when I saw the traits in my son, the common traits that he had, and then I learned how it's different for women and girls. And then I
Mhm.
realized, oh my gosh, I'm autistic as well. And so I just researched like crazy for a lot of years, and here I am now.
I've got a daughter. I've got a daughter who's 7, and she was recently diagnosed.
Mm,
And I saw a lot of it early on. I think probably
yeah.
starting about 18 months, you start spotting little things. But I was also looking for a lot of stuff, and I didn't see it.
Mm,
So I was kind of hoping that it maybe wouldn't be there. For women, I think there's like a 5-to-1 ratio, like five men to every one woman. So it's a lot more rare in females. But like she had some of those traits. And today it's 2025. Like she's got a group of teachers that are surrounding her. She's got people that are helping her with every one of these things.
that's
She doesn't
fantastic.
know that there's even anything going on, and she's getting tons of support that just didn't exist when I was a kid.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I didn't even use the word autism with my son until he discovered it in high school, and then asked if he could be evaluated. So that's fantastic that your daughter's getting this great support now.
Yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely.
Were you intimidated at all or freaked out by your diagnosis, or just was it just a logical like, aha?
Yeah, it was really just that aha moment because, once I started to research it and read about other people that were like me that had similar traits, everything just started to click and kind of made sense. I've used it in my career over the years too. I mean, when I was in college, I always loved to write. I started doing it when I was a kid, kept it up every chance I could. But my parents basically told me writing is a fantastic hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job. So it always became this thing that I did on the side. And one of the jobs that I had, I was working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. And I would write, I wrote a ton of memoirs for other people. So I would sit down with, let's say, a famous politician and, interview her for a couple of days. And then I'd have to take that and turn that into a book written from a female's perspective in first person. And I was able to do that. And, I think part of that is because I'm autistic. I also noticed that I was able to take, if somebody put a writing sample in front of me, I could read that and I could pick up on the basically the vocabulary, the writing style, the cadence and pacing of the author, and continue writing in their voice. So I got hired quite a bit to finish projects for other people that they weren't able to complete because I could basically write them in the same voice that they were started in. And all those things, I was doing all of this, but I had no idea it had anything to do with autism until, I got the diagnosis. And, a couple of years later, I looked back on it and said, oh, that makes sense now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great skill that most people don't even have. So fantastic.
No, I think a lot of it comes from, like autistic people, we mimic others, in a lot of situations, particularly social situations. So if I'm at a party and somebody cracks a joke, I'm going to laugh because everybody around me is laughing. And it might be like a millisecond behind everybody. But I've learned to kind of fake my way through it. I mimic everybody. And what I found is I was also doing that on paper. I could mimic the words of other people.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's kind of like a composer of music, but you are a composer with words.
Yeah, I mean, it all kind of ties together. It's all patterns. At the end of the day, like I mentioned, I wrote computer code, and it's no different than writing a song. It's no different than writing a
Right.
book. When you write that first line of code, you have to understand how it's going to impact that last line, and then everything else in between.
Yeah, fantastic. How did your family respond to your diagnosis?
Honestly, we haven't really talked about it a whole lot. I was already an adult. I had moved out of the house, long by the time I got the diagnosis. So it's not really come up. My sister runs a hospital in Florida, so we've talked a little bit on that front, particularly when my daughter was born. Just how it impacts kids and things like that. Um, it's funny because I talk to other people about it a lot more than I do my own family.
Interesting. Wow. Do you remember anything that your parents did when you were younger that actually helped you, even though none of you were aware of autism at the time?
I don't know if they did anything that helped me. I mean, one of the things that my mom did, which is, it's kind of funny looking back on it, but like back in the 70s, if you were left-handed, like, people didn't want you to be left-handed. It's a right-handed world. And I started this life left-handed. And my mom forced me to use my right hand. And, like I've since read studies where that can actually lead to some of these types of problems because your brain starts to develop differently because you're trying to change, something that's basically hardwired. So I've wondered if that had something to do with it. The flip side is now I'm ambidextrous. Like I can use both hands. I can write with both hands. I'm building a
Really?
treehouse for my daughter out back. I can, work a hammer with both hands. So that's
Right.
all good. But it makes me wonder, like if I had, been left a left-handed person from the get-go, like would I still have this?
Right. Yeah, I'm left-handed as well, and I was not forced to switch, which is, I think, a newer thing that there's a lot more left-handed people in the world now because they kind of stopped doing that.
Yeah, I mean it's all good until you pick up a guitar or some golf clubs and run into the
Exactly.
occasional thing meant for that right-handed portion of the world.
Yeah, that I definitely saw an issue with golfing with my left-handedness. So tell me about your early stages of reading. Reading kind of is the building blocks of writing. Do you remember how it felt when you read, like in your mind and in your body when you were younger?
Yeah, I mean, reading for me has always been an escape. We didn't have a TV in the house when I was a kid. And then even when we got one, we only got three channels because, it was the 70s again. And like we just put the antenna out. So there's nothing worth watching as a kid. But we used to hit the library all the time. And I started reading around the time I was 3. By the time I got into kindergarten, I read all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews and moved on to like Charles Dickens and some of the classics. But it was always an escape for me. I knew, when life was getting rough or if I, just wanted to get away, I could open up the cover of a book and get lost in those pages. And I quickly tried to replicate that. I was writing stories when I was pretty young. My sister is 15 months younger than me. So I'd staple the pages together and I created a little library in my room and she'd check them out and I charge her late fees. Like I
That's
was probably five
awesome.
or six. Yeah, I mean, but I was a little kid when I was doing that, so it's like it's something I've just always done. But I think looking back on it, like I've never had any formal training as an author, or I've never taken an MFA program or anything like that. But I've read so much. Again, everything to me is patterns. So I see the pattern in a book. This is the beginning, the middle, the end. This is where the climax has to happen. I see that 3-act structure. I see the framework of it. So when I'm writing a book, I'm able to put all that down on paper without actually really thinking about it. Like I know when that 3rd act needs to start because intrinsically it just feels like it needs to start here. And if I go further, if I try to push it beyond that point, it almost feels like I, missed a turn on the highway that I was supposed to take. And at some point I have to put the car in reverse and head back and go that way. But like I always seem to hit that particular structure. Like I didn't know what a 3-act structure was until I had started publishing books.
Wow.
And then, people broke down my titles and, they all fit a 3-act structure. So like that framework has always been there.
That's fascinating that you just intrinsically felt it. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I've had offers to take MFA programs, since then, and like I'm afraid to do it. Like I don't want any formal training because whatever formula I've stumbled into is working, and I don't want to mess with it.
For sure. I wouldn't want to mess with it either. I've done so much research on you in the past week. I feel like I've been a stalker. But I heard you say in one of your interviews that when you read or when you write or maybe both, you see the words in color or the characters in color.
Yeah, I can break out the different sections by character, and I visualize them in different colors. I think a lot of that comes from back when I worked as a book doctor. So a book doctor is basically somebody that gets hired to fix somebody else's book. Like an agent might get it, and it's really good, but it's missing something. Like maybe it's too long, or the person can't write dialogue, or whatever the problem is. They would hire somebody like me to come in and basically correct those things. And one of the first exercises I used to do, because a lot of people have trouble with point of view, or they do what we call head hopping. Like a chapter should always be in one particular character's point of view the entire time. So if you put one sentence down that's all of a sudden a thought from another character that's in that room, it takes the reader out of the story. So one of the things that I did to eliminate that in a lot of my projects, I would go through with a highlighter and I would highlight each section in different colors based on the character. And before I knew it, my brain was actually seeing the words that way. So even today, if I pick up, I could pick up the latest Stephen King book, it doesn't matter. Like I can see the words in different colors based on, whose point of view they actually belong to.
That's fascinating. And when I heard you say that in that interview, it made me think of synesthesia. Are you familiar with that? Where different senses can combine, like sight and
I've heard the term
taste?
before, and that may be part of it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, a lot of people with autism, I don't know about a lot, but many people with autism have that synesthesia. So I wonder if that's something that you have, but just haven't realized it.
Yeah, it's very possible.
Yeah, it's very cool. I struggled reading, like I had the opposite when I was younger. I struggled with reading. I'm dyslexic, so it took me a while to catch up, and I was like wondering how all the other kids were keeping up so fast. But my mom would give me books to help me. She knew that I struggled. She would help me just find books that I was interested in, and somehow like her interest in helping me spurred me to catch up and like surpass the other kids in my class. And when I was 8 or 9, she gave me the book Sybil. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but it's about a woman
That's
with
yeah.
split
Sally Field
personality.
played the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I read the whole thing as a very young girl. And I think that's why I'm interested in psychology now. But
it's a fantastic book.
yeah, it is very interesting. It's one of the scariest books I've ever read. And I normally don't read scary books or thrillers anymore because I discovered along the way that scary books, like I visualize and the images stay with me and it causes bad dreams and things. So I just stopped reading them. But I think because I've been like studying psychology and doing shadow work with, Carl Jung's theory and everything, I think that maybe the timing of me investigating psychology and shadow work has allowed me to like see your invitation to join my podcast and I got one of your books and I'm reading it now.
You picked the longest one I think I've ever written.
Well, why I picked it is because, again, in one of your interviews, you explained that this is a remake of Great Expectations. Is that correct?
Yeah, Great Expectations is probably my all-time favorite book. So this is kind of like a retelling of it. So if you were to imagine Stephen King writing Great Expectations, I guess that's about
Yeah,
as close of a comparison as you can get.
yeah,
It's funny though, in today's world, they actually teach the book you have there.
really.
They'll give it to high school students because it's written as a modern day thriller. So it kind of ropes kids into reading.
Yeah.
And then when they finish this book up, they want to read Great Expectations. So they jump back and read the classic.
Yeah.
So we sneak it in there.
That's awesome. Well, and I picked that one because I did love Great Expectations when I was younger. And I thought, well, if I'm going to read any one of your books, I think that's a great place to start. And now I'm a super big fan. Like, I'm like, oh, I can actually read this and it's not scaring me to like, I'm able to sleep at night still. And so I'm a fan now. How fantastic is that?
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. And I've been writing, like, I always write notes when I read books. I don't know if you can see, but I
Oh
have
yeah.
like 2 pages of notes already. And I've only, there we go. I've only read the first part one, and I have all these notes, but I'm writing notes of the autistic characteristics I'm noticing in your character in Jack. I don't know if you
Yeah,
are
I
aware
gave
of
him a
that.
little bit just to make him a little quirky.
Yeah, it's very effective. I'm like, oh, that's an autistic trait. That's an autistic trait. So I love that about it. Do
Yeah,
you
I've
feel
done
like
it to a
you?
couple. I've got an FBI agent named Frank Poole in
Ah,
my 4MK series, and I've given him a couple of those traits as well.
okay. Cool. I was wondering if you were like modeling him after your younger self or if you're just giving him autistic traits in general.
You know, that's sort of like the question, like where do the stories come from? And like I
Yeah.
really don't know the answer to that. Like with this particular book, like I had that title in mind for a long time. And it's a crazy title. The title, for those of you who couldn't read it, is "She Has a Broken Thing Where Her Heart Should Be." So everybody pushed back on that. You know, my agent said it's too long, nobody's going to understand it. You know, like the book is too long. You know, like they had all these complaints about it, but like I had that title, and I knew it was going to be about a kid. We're going to start with him at the cemetery visiting his parents' grave, and he's going to run into a little girl sitting on a park bench, and he's going to strike up some kind of conversation with her, that's going to stick with him, and he's not going to see her again until that exact same day 1 year later, and that pattern repeats year after year after year. So I had that in mind, but I didn't have much more, and then I just sat down and just started writing it. So I see a lot of these stories. It's almost like watching a movie in my head just play out, and I'm just writing it down as fast as I can. Like I don't know why the characters are doing what they do half the time, but you know, I try to honor what they do.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. Do you struggle with sometimes having too many ideas and stories in your mind and like, oh, I got to get that down and that down and that down?
There's always a bunch of them. I mean, I've got an app on my phone where I write all these things down, and it's literally a file called ideas. And you know, there's enough in there to keep me busy for the rest of my life. But there's usually one in particular that just sort of jumps out at me at any given time, and you know, that's the one I go with.
Okay. The one that tugs at you, huh?
Yeah, you know, I'm in a cool position where I can kind of write whatever I want whenever I want, you know. So there's no reason to force myself to write something I don't want to write. I've got plenty of friends that work in this industry where they'll write a book and it takes off, and all of a sudden they have to write that same book but different, and they have to turn it in every year, you know. And like that scared me half to death. Like I didn't want to get caught in that particular hamster wheel.
Yeah.
So, right out of the gate, I purposely wrote, a horror novel, then I wrote a thriller, and I wrote another horror novel. The book that you have there, I had been told that my audience at that point was women 45 and over. So I wanted to write a book that would appeal to a younger audience, which is what this one is. So that it was sold as a young adult novel. So I started bringing readers in their teens and their 20s, just to expand my audience. So I'm constantly doing things I'm not supposed to as an author, but it seems to be working.
I love that. And you're very smart about it and very business minded and creative in growing your audience. It's
Well, I think a lot
great.
of it, when I worked in the finance industry, I did that for 23 years. I saw a lot of companies, go from, literally an idea on a napkin to a public company, over a certain amount of time. And I saw what worked with those companies. I saw what didn't work. So I got a ton of business experience from some of the smartest people in the world. So I kind of brought all that to the table, as an author. Like at the end of the day, I know I'm selling a product, I'm selling a widget. I can claim I'm an artist, but that's really not the truth. Like I'm basically creating something somebody else has to sell. So I always try to keep that in mind with every book that I write. And in today's world, I write with James Patterson quite a bit. He started off in advertising. He worked on a marketing firm in New York before he started writing books. So we constantly have conversations about just the business side of things and where everything is going, and how can we get in front of this audience that we're don't normally read us. How do we expand? It's no different than selling a kid cereal. You put the box on the table in front of you, and like, how are we going to market this? I just
Yeah.
happen to do it with books.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's a great skill. You could teach so many different topics of, writing and marketing and you do with even just your podcasts and the interviews that you do. I've learned a ton just from listening to your interviews over the past week.
Yeah, that show is fun. We've got a podcast called Writers Inc., which I didn't want to do initially. A guy approached me at the horror writers convention, a guy named Jay Thorne, and I didn't even know him at the time, and asked me if I wanted to co-host a podcast. And being autistic, public speaking is like one of the things that scares me half to death. So, like because I didn't want to do it is the reason that I did do it. I decided, well, if I'm going to be forced to be in front of a microphone once a week talking to who knows how many people, that's going to help me come out of my shell, and I'll get better at it. So that's one of the things that I learned from that therapist early on. Like I could continue to repeat patterns that, bothered me or were difficult for me, or I could hit them head on and kind of put myself in those situations. And the more I did that, the more desensitized I got to those particular issues.
Yeah,
Public speaking is no longer a problem. I
that's
think we're like
awesome.
300 episodes in, and we've had every big name author you can think of on the show. And it's fun for me because we get to drill down to their origin story, find out what they were doing before they started writing. And every one of them has a cool tale. And I don't think we've heard the same story twice yet.
Wow. That's cool. It's kind of like your inner thriller, like you facing your demons and your monsters that are after you. You just faced them and tackled them.
If you don't, they just keep coming back.
Yeah, they do. So true. Going back to writing and your characters, when you're writing them, do you physically feel what they're going through?
I think in a lot of ways I do, because I see them as real people. I really don't even start a book until I have those characters completely fleshed out. I understand who they are. So, yeah, when they're in a rough situation, like I feel that. And I try to communicate it as best as I can on paper, which is tricky because a lot of the things that, quote unquote, normal people feel as an autistic person, I don't. But I'm very good at observing those particular feelings. They could be in a book or watching something on Netflix or whatever, but I make mental notes on how people actually react under certain situations. And then I'm able to put it down on paper, even if that's not the way I would personally react if I were in that situation.
Oh, that's awesome. And I also learned, obviously, from listening to your videos that you live near water and you run every day. Do you feel like if you didn't do that, that you would carry like the stress of what your characters feel with you into the evening?
Sort of. I don't know that I would call it stress. When I first started writing books, I was what they call a pantser, which basically means I would come up with the idea for the book, I would create my characters, and then I would just kind of drop these people into the mix of whatever situation was happening and let it play out on paper. And I didn't know where the story was going. So every day when I would finish writing, I would have to figure out, like what comes next, what comes next. So I quit. My workday ends at 3 o'clock. I live on a little island off the coast of Portsmouth in New England. So I do a lap around the island. It's 4.2 miles, takes about an hour or so. I kind of walk part, I run part, but I use that time to figure out what comes next in the story. And I always stayed ahead of it. And as long as I know what's coming next, it doesn't create any anxiety for me. If I were to, try and stop and not know what comes next, that would probably become problematic. I learned a long time ago, particularly when I was in the corporate world, I had some certain tricks that I would do in order to keep writing every day. I wrote every day, which is important. I think writing is very much like going to the gym. It's a muscle you have to exercise. But when I would stop writing, I always stopped mid sentence. I always knew what was coming next, and I think that relieved that particular anxiety. And my brain would continue to work that story. So when I sat down the next day to continue the story, I just kind of hit the ground running.
So fascinating to me because I work with autistic kids and I know a lot of people with autism, they struggle if they can't finish something like a puzzle or a game or like a video game, especially. So for you
Yeah.
to be able to not finish a sentence, that would drive some autistic people absolutely insane. But it's not that you're not continuing because you're just continuing in your head instead of on paper.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing, I absolutely have. If you put a task in front of me, like I have to get it done. I was talking to my wife about this yesterday. It's almost like there's a voice in the back of my head that just starts screaming if I don't get it done, and it gets louder and louder and louder until I finish whatever that particular task is. With a book, I guess to me, it's just different because I know I can't sit down and write the whole thing all at once. But I do have certain goals. I write 2 to 3,000 words a day. So, like, as long as I hit that particular goal, I think I satisfy whatever that need is to like finish the goal, I guess is what I'm getting at, even though the book itself isn't finished, knowing that as long as I hit that goal day after day after day, the book will get done.
Yeah, that's a great way to break down the bigger problems. A lot of students need that. Like I need that in my instruction classes, the breakdown of the big paper, the big project.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it for me, it just comes down to having a very structured day. Like I start writing first thing in the morning. I get up at 7. I go straight to my desk with my cup of coffee and just start working. I turn off the internet first thing because it's too distracting. I usually have my 10,000 or my 2 to 3,000 words done by 10 o'clock. Then I turn the internet on and my inbox fills up with all the business side of stuff. Then I do interviews, things like that. Talk to my agents, do the business side of things. But then 3 o'clock, I know that quitting bell is going to ring. And as long as I follow that pattern every day, I seem to be okay. But like if I go on a trip, if I travel or something, and I can't follow that schedule, then that becomes problematic for me. Just being an autistic person, like I have to
Yeah.
write every day, or I start getting twitchy because I haven't done this thing that I'm supposed to do. So like I've been balancing that my entire life as well.
Wow. So how do you scratch that itch when you're traveling?
A lot of times I'll take out my phone. I've written books on my phone before, scribble something out on a piece of paper if I have to.
Hmm.
Yeah, I can write pretty much anywhere. Yeah, it's the cool thing about it. I really don't need anything other than a pen and piece of paper. So I make sure I get it done, one way or the other.
That's awesome. I bet you come up with some really interesting ideas when you're on the fly, huh?
Yeah. I met a very cool lady. Where was I going? It might have been Budapest. But she was sitting next to me, and she had something called face blindness, which I've never heard of before. But she literally couldn't recognize other people, to
Oh,
the
yeah.
point where she had her own family. She had photos of her husband and her kids on her phone, even though they were sitting right next to her on the plane. Like she had to have pictures of them to be able to point them out. So like there's a story in that somewhere. I haven't figured out what
Yeah.
it's going to be yet, but there's a book in there.
Yeah, that's for sure. How did you come to pick the thriller genre as your favorite? Like, do you feel like it picked you, or like you wrote a bunch of different genres and decided that's my favorite?
It's a little bit of both. So when I was a kid, I mentioned some of the stuff that I read. My mom had an antique store, so we used to hit a lot of garage sales. And I remember going to a garage sale one time, and a guy had a box of books, and sitting up on top was Dracula. And I was 8 years old, and I picked it up. It was 25 cents. I didn't think my mom would let me get it because it looked pretty scary. But she let me buy it, and I took it home, and I read it really fast, and it scared me half to death. Like I slept with the lights on for like 3 weeks.
Wow.
But that's the first time I had ever gotten like an emotional reaction out of a book. And I think I've been chasing that ever since as a reader
Yeah.
and a writer, trying to recreate that. So my very first book I wrote was a horror novel, but I had done so much working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter on thrillers, I knew I could do that too. And horror is a fairly small segment of the reader community. Thriller is much bigger. So I figured if I bounced back and forth, I could probably pick up the best of both worlds and get a much larger audience than I would if I just focused on one type or the other. So if you look at my publication schedule, I've always bounced, horror, thriller, horror, thriller. I just bounce back and forth between the two. And they share a lot of elements. My Wikipedia page, I think you were reading from that at the beginning. It says that all my books have a common thread of suspense, but may include elements of this or elements of that, which is kind of how I tie it all together.
So what is the difference between horror and thriller?
Like I know it when I write it. Horror, like I can get away with a lot more, like I can add supernatural elements to it. Sometimes it can be a little bit more graphic as far as, somebody dying, things like that. But what I've found is that I incorporated quite a bit of that into my thrillers. The Fourth Monkey, when that first came out, I got a lot of comparisons to Sevens and Silence of the Lambs, mainly because it was a thriller. It's a police procedural, but I took a lot of horror elements and put it in there. Things that typical thriller writers or readers never saw in a book before. I mean, I think that's why it worked so well. So I purposely mix it all up.
Okay. Again, so just business smarts involved there.
I try.
Yeah. Heard you say that you caught that thrill, that emotional thrill of reading Dracula when you were 8. And that just resonates with me when I read the book Sybil when I was 8 or 9. And I feel like I've been chasing to understand people like in the psychology realm since then. So it's really fascinating how reading at a young age can really set up like how you can feel the world and understand the world. And then it sets you up for the rest of your life. And I hope
Well, I think
like
our
other,
brains are still forming at that point.
yeah,
To read a book like Sybil at that age, I mean, that says a lot, but I can see where that would open a door to psychology because it
yeah.
really makes you second guess everything you've ever learned or felt before about other people. It's written very well. There's another one, I think it's called Splintered,
Mm,
very similar and also based on a real person.
yeah.
Like once you go down that rabbit hole, like I found like 10 other books just like it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's just a great encouragement for kids out there to read more than just their phones, to read an actual book and see where it will like expand your mind for not just that moment in time, but all of their lives.
Yeah, I mean, you could literally go to any place you've ever wanted to go. You can meet people you never would have met. You know, it's like watching a movie with an unlimited budget in your head. Like, to me, there's nothing better.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I love that. I already answered this question. I gotta skip ahead. I've gone off script. I've just been enjoying the conversation so
Uh-oh.
much. It's okay. I just already covered a lot of this stuff. I think you already answered this, but how do you feel that autism has helped you in your writing process, creative process, your business process?
I mean, I think all of the above. You can't really see my desk behind me, but like there's literally nothing on it. But I'm working on 12 different books right now, because I'm able to see that structure and the framework all up here. So I think that that's a big part of it. From the business standpoint, like I'm wearing a lot of hats, I'm juggling a lot of different things. When I talk to other authors, I do a lot of presentations at conferences for authors, and I'll just run through my typical day and the different things that I do, and they're like, "You do that by yourself?" I said, "Well, no, I've got two employees." But I'm still running this particular business, and it can be very overwhelming, to somebody that's not autistic. Like I've always been very good at organization. Like when I left that brokerage firm, they had to hire three different people to replace me because they couldn't find one person who could do everything I was doing. To me, it felt like a normal workload. Like I have to fill every second.
Yeah, I've taken the place of two people in jobs before. And then when I've left, they've had to hire several people to replace me as well. So I can relate to that. But
Yeah.
I need to see my physical work in front of me. I think we're the opposite there. I think I have what's called object constancy. Like I have to see the things in front of me, kind of like the woman with mind blindness. She need to see the pictures of her family. Like I need to see my notes and my different projects that I'm working on physically, not just in my head. So that's a really fantastic skill that you're able to see those things in your head.
I think it's just different just because, like I'm literally working in a world that doesn't exist except for in my head. It's like I've tried to cross that boundary a little bit. Like I've got a large TV monitor in my office. And for the latest book, I create character sketches for everybody in the book. Basically their physical traits and, mannerisms, all that kind of stuff. I tried an experiment and I took one of those character sketches and I dropped it into Grok, which is an AI, and asked it to create an actual image of this particular person. So I did that for all the characters in the book. So on my monitor, I've got these images of all the characters in my book that were created by AI based on my physical descriptions.
Wow.
So to me, that helps a lot. There was a cabin that was involved in the story. So like I actually created the floor plan of the cabin and that's up there on my monitor,
Cool.
for silly stuff. Like, you want to make sure that, every time your character turns in a particular direction, they're facing the same room. And because if you're making up a house, like it's very easy to mix all that stuff up too, but you have to
Yeah.
get it right for the reader to really feel it.
That's a great trick. Actually, I was struggling to do that in when I was reading your book because I have to like I said see it, and you were describing the way the person was moving in the apartment. I can't picture that, and I didn't like force it because I know I would have to draw it to be able to do that, and I just moved on. But yeah, that's a great skill too. I
Yeah.
would
I mean,
love
if
to.
you were to, if you were to, you could actually draw out like pretty much every apartment, every house, every building I've ever done. I always sketch it out like there's a physical layout there just to make sure that I get the details
Yeah,
correct and they stay consistent.
there could be a J.D. Barker coloring book with all the characters from your books. That would be
Maybe.
Pretty fun. Oh, I get so many crazy ideas as I talk. So, do you think you see the world differently than most people?
Probably. I don't know if that's better or worse or, just different. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that I see that I think other people gloss over, and vice versa. There's a lot of stuff that other people see that is completely over my head that I don't notice at all.
Yeah, that's probably true. I know you see patterns because you've already clearly demonstrated that. Seeing patterns is a really common autistic trait. Do you think well, you already said you notice more detail, but it's more than just noticing detail. Like you're able to write the detail in a way that we can like see it, smell it, like almost touch it in our own brains. I think that would be hard to do if you didn't have that autistic ability to incorporate all those senses into your writing.
I think so. A lot of it comes from working as a book doctor, working with editors, working with agents, them telling me what they felt needed to be in a book. So those kind of things get ingrained in my head. But then I do recognize it everywhere. Like if my neighbor mows his lawn, like I know the pattern that he's going to use to mow his lawn, and he knows it too. But like, I've seen it before. So like I recognize all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. It jumps out at me. Like nothing in this world to me seems random. There's a pattern behind everything if you look close enough.
Yeah, that's true. Wow. Do you communicate better in writing or out loud? Like I'm better in writing, very little out loud, except for when I'm purposely doing stuff like this, but like in your own daily life.
Yeah, definitely much better on paper. Depending on the situation, my wife and I, like she knew that I was autistic from the get go. When we had that conversation, at the beginning of the dating process. So we've always tried to verbalize as much as we possibly can because we found that even in like text messages where she's a fantastic writer and I can write, but like in text messages, things fall between the cracks. There's certain intonations and stuff that you just assume and they may not be correct. So we try to verbalize everything, but like when I have to get an actual thought down on paper, like I always put my thoughts down on paper. Like that's the only way I can get them all down, make sure that they're clear and concise. When I have an actual conversation, right after that conversation is over, I think of 10 other things I should have said or I should have said differently. You can't go back and edit, not a live
Yeah.
conversation, but you can when it's on paper.
Yeah. Well, you can though, because I've developed what I call the circle back technique. So I tell people like, oh my gosh, we had this talk yesterday or last week. I want to circle back to that because I've thought of some things since the conversation that I would like to add to it. Like, can we go back to that? And that's helped me.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the autistic person in you too, because now all of a sudden you've got a situation that you haven't closed. You can't tie a bow on it because it's not
That's
done yet.
true.
Yeah, so you have to finish it up.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. That is brilliant. I love that. So, going back to the title of my podcast, I should say that out loud. Is there something or anything that you maybe haven't said to the world, or maybe you have a million times and it's worth saying again, that you would like to encourage other autistic people um, to do or feel or go for? Or
I think it's important that we all talk about it. I work with a lot of autistic parents, and that just wasn't a thing when I was a kid. But like I met a family, I guess about 3 years ago, and like their kid was 18 months old, and he would just bang his head against the wall to the point where he would just start bleeding, and he would scream for no reason. And like these are things that I did when I was a kid. So it's, for the parents, like they're living in that world at that particular moment. It seems like there's no end in sight. It seems, horribly negative, so like for them to be able to sit down with somebody like me, who's now 54 years old and has gotten through all of that and, is fairly successful in the things that I've done, it gives them a light at the end of the tunnel. So I try to talk about that kind of thing as much as I possibly can. And I think the world has gotten better about it, over the years. Again, back in the 70s, nobody did. Nobody
yeah,
talked about it.
yeah. Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing those details. And it's so true. Like the kids I work with, that is a very common thing is the head banging and how scary that is for parents and wondering like, is this ever going to end or change? And parents can easily give up in that situation. So I love that you are inspiring even parents to not give up on your kids, but stay positive, keep going.
Well, it's funny because I think autistic people, like we can spot each other. Like if there's a crowded room, like you can see another autistic person from across the room. Like there's a
Yeah.
kindred spirit there. So if I'm in a room with a little kid that's autistic, like there's a connection already. And if that kid's parents if they're not autistic, like they don't have that connection. They don't necessarily see it the way that I do or you would. So I think it's almost like being a translator in a lot of ways. Like you're able to communicate both sides of the story and hopefully get to some kind of resolution because now all of a sudden both parties are able to talk.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think translator is a good word, but maybe a whisperer, like a autistic child
Yeah.
whisperer, because sometimes you don't even have to say anything. You can just interact even non-verbally and have an actual communication.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I've been toying around with, because of I'm so interested in psychology. I'm wondering, would you ever consider writing your own memoir? I know you've done other people's memoirs, but is that something that you want to do someday?
I probably should, but that means I should also be journaling or doing something to write all these things down as they happen. And like every time I have that thought, I tell myself, "Oh yeah, I'm going to start doing that," and I don't start doing it. But having a daughter, I think has kind of pushed me towards wanting to do it. Because my own father, he passed away when he was 79, and him and I, like we had maybe one like legitimate, hard conversation together where he told me about where he grew up and his brothers and sisters and things like that. The rest of the time, he was just sort of there, like barely present in my life. And there was, because of his age, like, there was no social media. There was literally, there's nothing that I can go back to look
Yeah.
at. The world today is a little bit different. Like everybody's on social media. Like if somebody passes away, you can go back, you can, find pictures of them when they were, 10 years old or whatever. Like all those things are documented. But for the older generation, that stuff doesn't exist.
Yeah.
My life is documented whether I want it to be or not, which my daughter has already picked up on. But, I think at some point I will sit down and try to write it up.
Yeah, I would love to read that for sure. I've actually been playing with titles for your memoir, but just because that's what I do when I write my memoir. I'm like, what's the title going to be? You want to hear my ideas?
Yeah, I want to hear what you got. And you can write it
Okay,
for me. You can
that'd
ghostwrite
be
my
fun.
memoir.
So, the scary systematic success of J.D. Barker is one.
Okay.
I am because I write is another. And
That's
then the
good.
tagline of I am because I write is it only happens when I don't write. This is like the scary thriller side of JD Barker in your memoir.
Okay, I see what you're
It
saying.
only
Yeah.
happens when I don't write. Like what happens when you don't write? That's
Yeah,
the
that's
thriller
a good
side
one.
of your
That's
brain.
that's actually a good title.
Awesome. Well, I had fun like just brainstorming that and learning about you and watching your videos and reading your book. Like is really fascinating to me, again, the psychology part, because I'm so like afraid of thrillers and horrors, but I think you've helped me to look into that side, that darker side of me and why I fear it. I've had, a backstory and scary things and fires. And so I think I just didn't want to, I've had so much horror like in real life. I don't want any more like fiction wise, but I don't know. Long story short, you've made me a fan. Sorry to go on a rant like that, but
I mean, there's, even when it comes to horror, there's different levels of it. There's a lot of horror that I won't read because it's too over the top.
really, wow.
So like I think you just got to find that right mix. But I think a lot of people shy away from it just because they think it's scary. So like their actual thoughts of what it is are more frightening than if they were to actually pick up the book and read it
That's so
and
true. That's
confront it.
where I came from recently.
Yeah.
I think you have
So
to find the right author of it.
I think so. I mean, I tend to read a lot of stuff. I read, the fantasy. I'll read romance. I read pretty much anything if it's a good story, and I'll give it a shot.
Yeah. And I think now that I started reading your book, one of your books anyway, the first of many probably, I think thrillers and horrors can, like you said, can be written not maybe not smartly, not intuitively. I think that's it. You write intuitively, and I connect with that, if that makes
Maybe
sense.
there's a voice there. I don't know quite where it comes from. But
Yeah.
I do know, luckily people like it, so again, it's a magic formula I don't want to tweak.
Yeah. Yeah. No, don't mess with what's working. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience before I kind of bring this to a conclusion?
No, I mean, you can find me at jdbarker.com. I'm on all the social medias at jdbarker. My latest book is called Something I Keep Upstairs, which there's a copyright behind me there. That side, whatever. The cameras are reversed.
All right.
That one just came out in May, and my latest title with James Patterson was called The Writer. That one came out in March, hit number 2 on the New York Times list. So any one of those is a good starting point.
Yeah, for sure. Or even she has a broken thing where her heart
Or
should
that
be.
one, if you want to pick that one up. I mean, that one's like, it's close to 1,000 pages. But the funny thing is, like, I travel the world now for books, and like I'll go to some foreign country I've never been to before, where I've got 5 or 6 titles out, and like that particular book is the one that everybody seems to put down in front of me and says, "This is my favorite. This is my favorite. This is my favorite."
Yeah,
All over the world. So
something to it.
there's something to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever read the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis?
No.
No. The reason I ask is because the monitoring that the people are doing in between the chapters, where they're surveilling the person in the box. To
Right.
me, that seems like what the Screw Tape Letters is all about. It's like it's two demons that are having a conversation about tormenting the people that they're tormenting. And it's kind of like a horror, I guess. But I don't know, that just made me think of it. It feels like that. And again, that's another book that I started reading once, and I slammed the book shut. I'm like, I'm not reading this. This is too scary. But then 10 years later, I picked it up and read the whole thing and loved it. So
You said that was C.S. Lewis, right?
C.S. Lewis, the Screw Tape
Yeah.
Letters. Yeah.
All right. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you again, JD, for joining me and sharing not only your incredible journey as a writer, but also your openness, especially about living with and thriving with autism. And you shared so much that I think is so inspirational to autistic adults and parents and autistic children. And I just hope so many people will listen and share this and just grow not just the awareness of autism, but understanding of it and acceptance of it, and a curiosity about it, and not kind of like me learning not to be afraid of a thriller genre in reading, but people not being afraid of autistic people and like talk to them and just interact with them and even have a nonverbal conversation, if even if the person's nonverbal, because we're people and we're
I think everything's a little scary until you understand it.
yeah, very true, very true. So again, as you already shared, jdbarker.com is your website, and then you're on all the socials, and I'll put that website in my show notes as well. And to my audience, if you've enjoyed this episode of I Should Say That Out Loud, please share it with your friends and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you find your podcasts, and leave a review. And it will really help people to understand more about autism and to start reading JD's books, which are fantastic. And just thank you so much for spending time with us today. And remember, sometimes the scariest and most powerful thing that you can do is simply say it out loud. Thank you, JD. I appreciate
Thanks
you
for
so
having
much.
me. All
You're
right, take
welcome.
care.